The last time Anakin Skywalker saw his wife Padme alive was on the planet Mustafar at the end of Revenge of the Sith. Anakin attacked her with the Force Choke, causing her to collapse and setting up his fateful battle against Obi-Wan Kenobi. Obi-Wan carried Padme back into their ship after defeating his former pupil, and they flew off to safety while Anakin, or what was left of him, was abandoned to die on Mustafar. While Emperor Palpatine did eventually show up and rescue Anakin by reconstructing him as Darth Vader, Palpatine informed Vader that, in his anger, he had killed Padme. Though Padme did indeed die shortly after the events of Mustafar, she did live long enough to give birth to Luke and Leia before giving up the ghost. Fast forward 20 years. While dealing with the threat of a growing rebellion, Darth Vader discovers a Force-sensitive young man named Luke Skywalker in their midst, fighting alongside his former mentor, Obi-Wan. As the crawler at the beginning of Empire Strikes Back said, Vader became obsessed with tracking Luke down, finally confronting him at Cloud City and revealing the true nature of their relationship. Strangely, despite what had to be a completely unexpected discovery by Vader in light of what Palpatine had told him about Padme's fate, Vader seems surprisingly calm about the revelation that she had apparently survived long enough to bear his child. Did it ever occur to him that Palpatine had lied, or was that even a consideration given his obsession with finding Luke? We actually have two questions to answer here. Obviously, there's the issue of Vader's reaction to this discovery, but we also need to establish whether or not Palpatine even knew for sure whether Padme had survived the encounter on Mustafar. Palpatine himself hadn't seen Padme or Obi-Wan depart the planet, so there wouldn't appear to be any obvious way he would know whether she had lived or died. However, as he has demonstrated many times throughout the movies, Palpatine's affinity with the dark side has given him insight into events he shouldn't have knowledge of, and in many cases, even events that haven't happened yet. His battle with Yoda also showed him to be every bit as strong with the Force as the Jedi Master, so if Yoda can sense the deaths of Jedi spread throughout the galaxy during the Jedi Purge, it stands to reason that Palpatine should detect the birth of not one, but two children who are supposedly at least as strong with the Force as Anakin Skywalker was. Then again, Vader's brief conversation with his master in The Empire Strikes Back would seem to indicate that Palpatine was as surprised by Luke's existence as Vader was. This could be for a number of reasons. First being, Palpatine really had no idea that Padme had survived long enough to give birth to Luke and Leia. This is possible, but the likelihood is questionable. While Vader might have been fooled by the way Padme was made up to look like she was still pregnant at her funeral, it's hard to believe that the all-knowing Palpatine didn't at least have some idea that Anakin's children had survived. Having watched every step Palpatine took to manipulate events towards his ultimate goal of supreme power over the galaxy, you can see that he was not prone to leaving things to chance. If he told Vader that Padme was dead, you could bet that he would follow up and make 100% sure that she and her unborn child, or, as it turned out, children, were definitely dead, so that they wouldn't suddenly pop up at some point down the line and make him look like a liar. That is, unless he didn't think it would matter, in the case that Palpatine knew Luke and Leia were born, but didn't consider them a threat until the destruction of the first Death Star. Again, not necessarily likely, since Palpatine would have probably sensed their strength with the Force from day one, but perhaps Palpatine assumed that even if Anakin's children survived, they would be relegated to their respective upbringings, Luke as a subsistence farmer on Tatooine, and Leia as the daughter of a senator, and would never become a threat to him. Even if he knew of their strength with the Force, he may have assumed that with the Jedi wiped out, except for Obi-Wan and possibly Yoda, they would never receive the guidance they would need to become a threat. Once Luke caught his attention by firing the shot that destroyed the Death Star, especially with Vader on his tail, Palpatine would have reconsidered his assessment immediately. At that point, he would have decided that Luke at least was powerful enough to be reckoned with, and at that point sent Vader to find him and turn him to the dark side. Another possibility is that Palpatine knew Luke and Leia were born and intentionally withheld their existence from Vader for his own purposes. Let's face it, loyalty was never one of Palpatine's best qualities, and it's possible that he knew full well that Luke and Leia had survived, and would grow up to be every bit as strong with the Force as their father was. The same way Palpatine had knowingly set Count Dooku up to be killed by Anakin all those years earlier, perhaps Palpatine may have been planning the same for Vader, waiting until his children grew up and were powerful enough that one or both of them would slay their father and take his place as Palpatine's new apprentice. This would seem to have at least been Palpatine's plan at the end, as he spent the last moments of his life trying to convince Luke to kill Vader and become his new apprentice. It fit with Palpatine's history, as he had manipulated Anakin into his service almost exactly the same way. The difference was that, unlike Anakin, Luke would walk away in one piece and not subject to the restrictions Vader's injuries had imposed on him. Palpatine had always planned for Anakin to become his unstoppable enforcer once he grew to adulthood and learned to harness his power. When his once promising apprentice was maimed at the hands of Obi-Wan Kenobi and reconstructed in much more physically limited form, it may be that Palpatine made the decision at that point to wait until Luke and Leia came of age so he could manipulate them into becoming the powerful servant or servants that he had planned Vader to be. After looking at the different possible scenarios, it's hard to believe that Palpatine didn't at least have some idea that it wasn't as simple as Padme's dead, end of story. But with all that in mind, let's look at how Vader might have reacted to discovering his son alive and running around on the Death Star 20 years later. Vader never confronted Palpatine about it that we saw, but he had to have spent a good deal of time rolling everything around in his head and trying to figure out how this was all possible. While Vader never spoke about whatever conclusions he may have come to, they probably boiled down to one of the following. First, one choice is that Vader assumed Palpatine didn't know any more than he did and instead blamed Obi-Wan Kenobi. While his master was obviously nobody's fool, Anakin, or Vader, appears to be a complete sucker for whatever the Emperor told him. Despite Palpatine's clearly shady character, and the fact that, for all intents and purposes, he forced Anakin to swear loyalty to him in exchange for saving Padme, which never happened by the way, Vader never seemed to have a second thought about remaining by the Emperor's side even after his choice to become a Sith apprentice cost him everything. Vader surely was witness to many, many more instances of Palpatine's duplicitous tactics in the years after the fall of the Jedi, and, by the time he discovered Luke, there's no way he could have had any illusions about who he was serving. In spite of all that, we got the scene in Empire Strikes Back where Vader actually works out a plan with his master to subvert his son rather than question the fact that he was even there at all. It stands to reason that Vader blamed Obi-Wan for hiding Luke from him. In fact, it would make sense that Vader blamed Obi-Wan for everything that had happened to him: Padme's death, his own physical destruction, and the eventual discovery that Luke survived and had been hidden from him. Remember, 20 years had passed since his battle with Obi-Wan on Mustafar, and that is a lot of time to let a grudge simmer. Defeating Obi-Wan on the Death Star was a moment he had been looking forward to for a very long time, yet Vader apparently continued to carry around a need to best his former master even after their final battle. The fact that he actually said that Obi-Wan's failure is now complete upon discovering that Luke had a twin sister seems to bear that out. Vader held Obi-Wan responsible for everything, and it may just have never occurred to him that Palpatine had misled him. On the other hand, Vader may have also have spent enough time with Palpatine by this point to know how he operates, and may not have been terribly surprised to find out that he had been deceived, if that's what happened. Vader, as we touched on a moment ago, had to have become very familiar with Emperor Palpatine's deceptive ways after spending 20 years by his side. While Vader may have been surprised to discover Luke was alive, he may not have been as surprised to find out he had been lied to as we would think. In fact, if you look back at the history of the Sith, the entire lineage is loaded with examples of Sith masters and apprentices continually trying to outmaneuver one another in a cutthroat struggle for dominance. As strange as it seems, it could be that he knew Palpatine lied, but just didn't care that much. On the other hand, Vader could have realized that Palpatine had lied to him, and began plotting immediately to usurp him. If Vader suddenly grew a brain and looked at the facts staring him in the face, he would realize that Padme didn't die on Mustafar after all, and that Palpatine had lied about how his rage had killed her. Once Vader began putting the pieces together and came to grips with the fact that Palpatine had deceived him, he may have decided to follow the long-standing Sith tradition and kill his master for his treachery. If Vader did make a move on Palpatine, the goal would have likely included not just taking over the Empire, but also becoming the new Sith Master, with Luke as his apprentice. Vader asking Luke to join him in overthrowing the Emperor and ruling the galaxy as father and son lends credence to this theory. Don't forget, the idea of usurping Palpatine had begun rolling around in Vader's head long before he ever discovered Luke. And he said as much not long after swearing his loyalty to Palpatine in the first place. Right before the battle with Obi-Wan on Mustafar, Anakin gave Padme pretty much the exact same speech he would give Luke years later, telling her that he could kill Palpatine so that they could rule the galaxy together. Anakin's lust for power was even visible as far back as the incident when he returned to Tatooine just in time to witness his mother's death. After wiping out the Sand People, Anakin lashed out with a tirade about how he should be all-powerful, and one day would be. The first step of Vader's plan would be to convince the Emperor that Luke would make a powerful ally if he could be turned, and not to kill him as the Emperor originally wanted. Vader was only partially truthful, because while he would indeed see that potential in Luke, it would be as his own ally, not the Emperor's. Even if Vader wanted ultimate power, he may have been held back from making a move if he wasn't sure he could take Palpatine by himself. At the very least, the possibility that Palpatine's Sith lightning could destroy his life support suit, which it eventually did, would be enough to stay Vader's hand. Luke, however, did not have the same limitation, perhaps using Luke as a surrogate, or at least letting Luke do the heavy lifting while Vader supported him from a distance with the Force. An alliance with his son would provide Vader with the opportunity he had been waiting for all this time. Thanks for watching this video, and as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave them in the comments section below, and how you thought Vader would have reacted when he discovered Luke had survived, and whether you think Palpatine knew all along, or was as surprised to discover that Luke and Leia lived as Vader was. If you'd like to support the Star Wars Wavelength channel, please click subscribe, so you can check back in whenever new videos are posted. Thanks again for watching, and may the Force be with you, always.